Hi, my name is Sparky Imeson. You may know me because of a book I wrote called Mountain Flying. I wrote the book based upon my experience as a mountain and backcountry charter pilot based in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Today I fly Cheyenne 400 LS and manage the aviation department for an oil company in Denver, Colorado. The book and this video contain many of the lessons which I learned while flying out of Jackson Hole. It also contains a bit of the wisdom I was able to absorb from some of the most experienced mountain pilots in the country. One of the limitations of a book is that there's only so much that you can show with still photographs and drawings. It's hard in a book to show things which have meaning because of action or motion. This tape contains techniques and information which are better presented in a visual manner than by words. There are three elements which come into play in any flying endeavor: knowledge, experience, and judgment. In this tape, we're going to try to help you gain a little bit of each. We'll help you gain knowledge by explaining some of the theory of mountain flying. We'll help you gain experience by taking you along on some actual flights into and through the mountains. And we'll try to help you gain some insight into the judgment of the safe mountain pilot by example. I am hopeful that I will be able to present some recommendations and some tricks of the trade, as well as pointing out some of the gotchas that cause the majority of problems in mountain flying. Mountain flying safety requires that you fly within the limits of your qualifications and equipment. If you can't do what you want to do, upgrade one or the other. If you do decide to upgrade your skills, make sure to work with a flight instructor who has mountain flying experience. The same thing applies to equipment. The most qualified pilot in the world can still get into trouble trying to push an aircraft beyond its limitations. If the equipment available doesn't suit the mission, change the mission or the aircraft. The basic premises of all mountain flying are: always remain in a position where you can turn toward lowering terrain, and do not fly beyond the point of no return, the place where reducing the throttle to idle allows you sufficient altitude to turn around. Don't exceed the limits of your own skill or the limits of your equipment. Respect the environment. Mountain storms, mountain waves, and density altitude can be killers. I want to ingrain these basic truisms of mountain flying into your minds. With these axioms firmly adhered to, you will not get into trouble with flying the mountains. Another way of stating these truths is: always have an escape route in mind and be in a position to exercise this option. In this tape, we will discuss common accident causes and prevention, flight planning, mountain weather phenomena, visual and optical illusions, techniques for mountain operations and performing takeoffs and landings at mountain strips. Safe flight in the mountains involves management of two limitations: the pilot, the airplane. To eliminate accidents, establish personal safety standards. To fly safely year after year, you will be concerned with two limitations. First, you must know your own limitations as a pilot, and second, you must know the aircraft's limitations. To eliminate accidents, you as a pilot need to establish some personal safety standards relating to weather, night flying, runway lengths, aircraft loading and range, and once you've established these standards, abide by them. Experience will allow you to expand your safety standards. If you study the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, safety statistics for any particular year and try to determine the most frequent cause factors for general aviation accidents, we come to the startling conclusion that the list remains relatively stable year after year and points out the need for continued refresher training to establish a higher level of flight proficiency for all pilots. The most frequent causes of light aircraft accidents are: 1. Continued VFR into adverse conditions. 2. Inadequate pre-flight preparation and/or planning. 3. Failure to obtain or maintain flying speed. 4. Failure to maintain directional control. 5. Improper level-off. 6. Failure to see and avoid objects or obstructions. 7. management of fuel. 8, improper in-flight decisions or planning. 9, misjudgment of distance and speed. 10, selection of unsuitable terrain. 11, improper operation of flight controls. It's easy to see that for the most part these are the same hazards that exist while flying anywhere. The difference in mountain flying is that the terrain tends to be much less forgiving of incidents. Accidents that might be just embarrassing or expensive in the flatlands can tend to be injurious or fatal in the mountains. I don't mean to be negative or try to talk you out of flying in the mountains. I just want to impress on you the proper preparation, training, and judgment are of extreme importance in the mountains. I'll take some liberty with an old saying here and tell you that mountain flying in itself is not inherently dangerous, but to an even greater degree than the rest of aviation, is terribly unforgiving of any carelessness, incapacity, or neglect. Probably every airplane manufactured since the First World War has been used for mountain flying, and each aircraft has its own set of limitations. It's not necessary for us to have a Maule, Super Cub, Cessna 180, or even a Turbo 206 for flying in the mountain, unless you need the particular performance that they offer. For rough fields, a tail dragger offers advantages. For high-density altitudes, a turbo is nice, and for extra short fields, a STOL kit is indispensable. If you plan to fly IFR over the western mountains, some pilots claim you have to have a turbocharged twin with known icing capability. Yet some people fly Cessna 172's IFR in the West all the time. Once again, it just boils down to using common sense and being honest with yourself about capabilities and limitations. Mountain flight planning requires you to account for a few factors which might otherwise be taken for granted. First, always study the trend of the weather over a large area. Mountain weather can change fast. Systems which appear innocent over the flatlands can become ferocious when they encounter high terrain. Pay particular attention to temperature dew point spreads. Mountain fields may be widely separated, and you don't want to get caught in fog or low clouds. Study winds aloft over the route. Winds which might be acceptable elsewhere can at times produce severe turbulence in the mountains. Study the terrain and pick the most favorable route. Often a short dogleg in your route can keep you over terrain which is much more hospitable. Before you depart, make sure that you have sufficient current information on your destination. In the West, state aviation agencies can be a valuable resource for information on remote strips. The state agencies visit mountain airports and often have more current information than anyone else. Make sure you know if there are seasonal constraints on airfield use. Is snow a factor? Is mud? Has the strip closed since the last charts were issued? Plan your flight to take place early in the day. There are two reasons for this. The first is that in the mountain valleys it can get dark very early. The second reason is that temperature and wind factors are generally less severe early in the day. Don't plan to fly over or through the mountains at night unless you are very experienced and have a knowledge of the route. It can get very dark and lonely over the mountains. If you lose an engine or an electrical system at night over the mountains, you've got very few outs. Verify the availability of fuel at mountain airports. You don't want to have to stretch your range over this kind of terrain if it turns out that fuel is not available. Whenever possible, file a flight plan for mountain trips. If there's a way to close the flight plan with a flight service station upon arrival, then it's no different than any other flight. Many times, though, the only way that you're going to be able to close your flight plan is to stay at or climb to an altitude which will permit radio communications through an FSS remote communications outlet. In most parts of the West, climbing to 12,500 feet will allow you to contact a flight service station somewhere where you can close your flight plan. If you cannot raise an FSS, you can always try to contact an air route traffic control center and ask them to relay your closure. Center frequencies can be elusive unless you have the IFR and route charts for the area. Closing a flight plan with center may or may not work depending on just how busy they are, but in a pinch, it's worth a try if all else fails. One other procedure you could use, if there's no other way to close your flight plan, is to try and raise a flight watch station on 122.0. The flight watch operator may be reluctant, but once you explain that you've exhausted all other methods, will probably cooperate. Sometimes the only way is to file a round-robin flight plan with the local flight service station. The round-robin flight plan works well if your flight will just take a couple of hours and you're going to return to the same area in which you departed. But this method is not practical for a flight of more than a few hours. In any case, always try to file a VFR flight plan and always know ahead of time how you are going to close it. Just make sure that whatever method you do use, you close your flight plan upon arrival. When you are reported overdue in the mountain states, massive efforts are set in motion quickly to find you. Now everyone knows that pushing the weather on a VFR flight is chancy. All it takes is a look at these statistics. Each year, some 200 accidents are listed by the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, as continued VFR flight into adverse weather conditions. And the really sad thing about this is that about 65% of these accidents involve fatalities. When you fly mostly over flat terrain, you sometimes gain confidence in your ability to test the weather, to take a look before deciding whether to continue on a flight. In the mountains, this can be, and often has been, the cause of serious fatal accidents, particularly in the winter months. Terrain can have a drastic effect on the rate at which weather grows and changes. Thunderstorms and snowstorms can grow and become severe very quickly. When you're flying in the mountains, you want to know, to the absolute limit of the forecasting art, what the conditions will be for the entire route of your flight. The bad weather escape routes which are available to you in the mountains may be severely limited in the surrounding terrain. Regulations allow you to fly in uncontrolled airspace when you're less than 10,000 MSL and less than 1,200 AGL in flight conditions of 1 mile clear of clouds. Even when you're more than 1,200 feet above the surface, regulations still allow you to legally operate with 1 mile visibility and remain 500 below, 1,000 above, or 2,000 horizontally from all clouds. Since the regulation allows it, novices try it. But if you want to see an extremely nervous pilot, watch an experienced pilot in visibilities of less than 5 miles in the mountains. He'll have an out. He'll be headed for the nearest suitable landing area or on the microphone demanding an IFR clearance from center. When marginal weather is encountered, the first thing the smart pilot does is admit to himself that he may not make it to his destination. Now, your decision to penetrate bad weather at low altitudes, that is, to scud run, should be made only if certain conditions are met. The experienced pilot develops rules and will not, under any circumstances, deviate from these rules. Should you decide to fly in the mountains when the weather is less than ideal, your rules should include a very sharply defined ceiling, good visibility, and an awareness that you will not scud run during the hours of darkness. Additionally, the experienced pilot will not scud run or fly a route which he hasn't previously flown at about 1,500 feet above the ground or less. And he will not scud run toward worsening weather. If weather reports of 5 miles visibility or better do not exist at stations at and beyond his destination, he doesn't go. He doesn't scud run into his final hour of fuel, ever. To the experienced mountain pilot, the minimum weather conditions for VFR flight are 2005. 2,000 foot ceiling, 5 miles visibility. When we establish these minimums, we're talking about a weather system that affects a large area that we are trying to penetrate. I'm not suggesting that if the visibility is momentarily reduced to less than 5 miles by a scattered shower, that you should immediately land the airplane, especially if you can see the sun shining on the other side. One frightening pilot technique practiced unconsciously by many pilots when the weather is marginal is that of flying near the cloud base. This is a natural tendency since it places the airplane farthest away from the ground. But you've got to realize that the forward visibility will be severely limited near the cloud base, allowing the pilot to fly into trouble before he can see it. The solution? Divide the area between the cloud bases and the ground into thirds and fly in the middle third, preferably in the bottom of this section. Weather forecast accuracy is influenced tremendously by what is known and what is measured. In the mountains, there's a distinct lack of weather reporting stations. Sometimes the only source of information is from pilot reports. Flight Watch and flight service stations always welcome pilot reports, even reports of good weather. Sometimes a report of good weather is even more valuable than when the weather is bad. There may be other pilots trying to get into or out of the mountains who will appreciate your information. Also remember that it never hurts to try to get an FSS or tower to solicit pilot reports for you. Even a report from an arriving or departing airliner regarding the extent of cloud cover can be had and can be very useful. One should always ask the nearest flight service stations or Flight Watch stations whether there are any recent pilot reports for your route or destination. When unforecast weather, good or bad, is observed, pilots should always make a pilot report for the benefit of others. One important thing that may not be obvious is that almost all weather reporting stations in mountainous areas are located in valleys. A 3,000-foot ceiling may be good VFR over the flatlands, but depending on the relative difference in height between the mountains and the weather observer, it may be terrible in mountain country. In the western mountains, a reported 3,000-foot ceiling almost always means that the mountaintops are obscured in clouds. When you're going to fly in the mountains, always evaluate what the reported and forecast ceiling means in terms of both the altitude of the reporting station and that of the surrounding terrain. One other hint for evaluating cloud cover in the mountains. Whenever possible, ask the FSS, tower, or other weather source if there are any reports on the height of the cloud tops en route and at the destination. It's good to know the depth of cloud systems, and often this information will allow you to evaluate the severity of a storm. If there are no pilot reports of tops, most FAA facilities will attempt to get one from another pilot on the radio if you ask them to. This can be very useful information if you find yourself in a bad corner. Also, keeping track of the rate at which cloud tops grow can be one of several useful indicators of the intensity, proximity, and severity of a storm. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you plan to fly along in the mountains on top of a broken or overcast layer VFR, just that it's a smart and prudent move to know all the dimensions of the weather that you will face. When you evaluate weather in the mountains, keep in mind that the terrain has a drastic effect on the way it changes and grows. The same weather that makes a benign and stable overcast layer near the coast can spawn a raging set of thunderstorms in the mountains due to the lifting action of the terrain. Remember, the go, no-go decision doesn't have to be difficult. Weather in the mountains can be divided into two categories: that which you can fly through or into, and that which you know you can't or are unsure of. In flying the mountains, weather is probably one of the most important safety elements which the pilot can evaluate and manage. For the mountain pilot, the second most important weather factor is wind. If you are accustomed to lower altitude flying, you probably think of the 20, 30, or more knot winds at 10 or 12,000 feet just in terms of whether they are on the nose or the tail. Remember that in the western mountains, many mountaintops are at these same altitudes. In studying the wind, we can come up with some generally acceptable rules of thumb. Surface winds of 20 knots or greater indicate we should proceed with caution or perhaps delay the flight. Often local conditions and experience suggest that even relatively light winds can be hazardous in the neighboring mountains. It never hurts to consult with an experienced local flight instructor charter pilot, or flight service station specialist when surface winds are present in the mountains. For instance, flying from Elko, Nevada to Reno on a clear day when the winds are blowing hard may make for a very rough ride, but usually will present no unusual hazard. The same wind velocity from Jackson Hole to Riverton, Wyoming might contribute to a risky and uncomfortable trip due to the Wind River mountain range, which often generates significant mountain wave activity. Mountaintop winds of greater than 30 knots usually means we should consider delaying the flight. When there is significant wind at ridge levels, ridges should be approached and crossed at an angle to allow the pilot to turn away from the ridge with the least amount of turn, should a downdraft be encountered. Again, this pertains to the basic premise of mountain flying. Always be in a position where you can turn toward lowering terrain. In the mornings, the wind blows up the canyons due to solar heating and convection. In the late afternoon and evening hours, there will be a reversal or downflow of wind. Perhaps the best way of remembering this is the fact that you get up in the morning and the wind blows up canyons or streams in the morning. This knowledge is useful when operating at mountain strips or airports located in canyons or river drainages. Most mountain ranges are oriented almost perpendicular to the prevailing westerly winds aloft. The major exception is found in the high Uinta Mountains of northern Utah and Colorado. Knowing this allows us to develop an insight into areas of updrafts and downdrafts and helps us identify areas of turbulence. The wind velocity may double over a ridge due to a Venturi effect between the ridge and undisturbed airflow. The altimeter reads higher than true altitude. You can also experience a Venturi effect between mountains. To properly fly in the mountains, you must visualize lift. The effects that you will encounter from wind blowing over rough terrain vary with the speed of the wind and the relationship of wind direction to ridge alignment. Terrain features may create radical wind flow patterns. One of the best ways to get yourself familiar with wind and its effects in the mountains is to visualize the wind as water in a river. Determine how this water would flow. Each mountain ridge, valley, and strip can pose unique problems with surrounding terrain influencing the local wind circulation patterns. Many mountain pilots advocate that if you get caught in a downdraft, you should lower the nose and maintain flying speed, feeling there is always a cushion of air next to the ground. There is a cushion of air next to the ground. It's true that downdrafts can't go through the ground. However, they certainly can go below the treetops. It is important to always maintain an awareness of the wind direction in order to visualize the probable updrafts, downdrafts, and surface winds if a forced or precautionary landing becomes necessary. The ability to detect wind direction while in flight can be very useful for the mountain pilot. Many backcountry airstrips lack a wind sock, and it is important to be able to recognize wind speed from the air. The best hints available to you for guessing surface wind speed and direction are observation of foliage, still water, and cloud shadows. For the relatively inexperienced mountain pilot, observation of foliage can provide only a gross estimate of wind speed and direction. Probably, all you will be able to determine from watching trees will be whether or not there are strong winds blowing in a canyon or over a ridge. If there is still standing water within view, you can usually get a pretty good idea of both wind direction and intensity by observation of the surface. With just a little bit of practice, you can derive the approximate wind speed by looking at the size of surface ripples and by observing the distance that the ripples are from each other. The wind direction is normally obvious once you locate the column area near one of the perimeters of the water. This column area is caused by the lee effect of the shoreline. The third method of estimating wind direction and speed is observation of cloud shadows. On a day when there are some puffy cumulus clouds aloft, you can generally get an idea of the wind direction and speed by watching their shadows on the ground. Just remember that the wind may change substantially down in the valleys and canyons due to the understandable effect of the terrain. Once you gain some experience in the mountains, you will be able to estimate the wind down low by observing the flow at mountaintop level. Just as you should always know
where you are located, you should also always try to know what the wind is doing, both at your cruising altitude and down in the valleys and canyons below. Keep in mind that the wind direction and velocity are more than likely different at the surface than above. There are three kinds of turbulence which may be encountered in the mountains even during good weather. The first is convective turbulence, which affects your flying much as it does out of the mountains. Just as anywhere else, you may encounter choppy updrafts from the heated ground and downdrafts when flying over rivers, lakes, ponds, or shaded areas. You may also encounter turbulence caused by wind flow over mountains, hills, and ridges. Even when the conditions are not favorable to mountain wave formation, you will feel some turbulence while flying over mountains if there's any significant wind present. This kind of turbulence is normally just an uncomfortable factor when you're cruising safely above the surrounding terrain. But it can be quite a serious hazard if you're flying down in the valleys and canyons and while landing or taking off. The third kind of turbulence you may encounter is that found at the mouth of a canyon or over the intersection of two drainages. Remember that in the morning, when the sun and temperature are rising, wind tends to flow up canyons. In the evening, when things start to cool down, the wind flow is down the canyons. In the mountains, creeks tend to run into rivers at a 90-degree angle. So what happens is that the wind flow up or down the side canyons meets that of the intersecting river at a right angle, causing some wind shear and burbling turbulence. If you're flying along the main channel of a river drainage, you can expect to encounter some greater or lesser amount of turbulence as you pass each place where a tributary enters the river. Often these are the same places where backcountry landing strips are located, at or near the confluence of two creeks or rivers. So if there is more than a slight amount of this kind of turbulence, you may encounter it at the worst time, when you are low and slow and dirty on an approach or climb out. The most significant form of turbulence in the mountains is that caused by mountain waves. Other than cloud cover and visibility, there's not much that can affect the pilot flying in the mountains more than the wave and rotor effect. By knowing the hazards associated with mountain waves, and by knowing where to fly to avoid the hazards, you can still conduct flights with pleasure and safety. Mountain waves are known by several names: mountain wave, standing wave, lee wave, gravity wave, standing lenticular, ACSL, or just a plain old wave. The presence of mountain waves can be likened to airmets and sigmets. That is because the conditions which result from waves may or may not be hazardous to a flight based upon the pilot's experience, the specific conditions encountered, reports from other pilots, and the operational limits of the aircraft. When a mountain wave is present with sufficient moisture to form lenticular clouds, the clouds appear stationary. But before trying to visualize too much, let's get a few basic features of mountain waves fixed in our minds. For a mountain wave to form, wind flow normally is nearly perpendicular to the mountain range, within 30 degrees of perpendicular. There's usually an increasing wind velocity with altitude, with the wind velocity 20 knots or more near the mountaintop level. For wave formation, normally there is either a stable air mass layer aloft or an inversion below 15,000 feet. Neither a completely unstable nor a uniformly stable airstream can produce appreciable lee waves.
With sufficient moisture, three typical wave clouds will form. A fourth type, the mother-of-pearl cloud, is usually only observed in Arctic regions. But the clouds merely point out activity and not wave intensity. When there is sufficient moisture for cloud formation, there may be one or more kinds of cloud visible. These are the cap cloud, or fern wall, lenticulars, and roll clouds. The cap cloud, or fern wall, is mostly on the windward side of the mountain. A fern gap may exist because the air is rushing down, and as it does, it compresses. The heat of compression reabsorbs the moisture, and a gap appears. The roll, or rotor cloud, is centered beneath the lenticular clouds. A mixture of dust and debris may also be present,
which forms the textbook description of the rotor, as a very dark, ominous-looking cloud that has rotating appearance. Turbulence is most frequent and most severe in the standing rotors just beneath the wave crests, or below mountaintop level. The rotor cloud will be downwind from the mountain range and will extend anywhere from the Earth's surface up to mountaintop level. Flying above mountaintop level will almost always allow avoidance of the rotor. The rotor cloud may be shown by clouds if there is sufficient moisture available, or it may be shown by dust and debris stirred up from the ground, or the rotor may exist without moisture or debris to delineate it. If this is the case, visualization will tell you where it is located. Avoid this area. The rotor contains some of the most violent turbulence known to man. The lenticular cloud appears stationary, although the wind may be blowing through the wave at 50 knots or more. The appearance of the lenticular clouds merely points out wave activity, not wave intensity at any particular level. If the edges of the lenticular are ragged and tattered, with fragments torn from the trailing edge, there will be turbulence present which is as violent as that found anywhere in the atmosphere. Just because a mountain wave exists is not a sure sign that your flight must be canceled or delayed. Usually, when a mountain wave condition exists, deviation around or over the mountain area is the prudent action. How high must an airplane pass to avoid the effect of mountain waves? Turbulence caused by extreme mountain waves can extend into all altitudes that you might use. Dangerous turbulence can usually be avoided by clearing the mountains at least half again as high as the height of the mountain. Thus, a mountain which peaks at 6,000 feet above the average terrain should be overflown at a minimum of 9,000 feet above the surrounding ground. If you suspect that mountain wave activity or substantial downdrafts exist, approach mountain ridges at a 45-degree angle to allow a quick turn from the ridge to an area of lowering terrain. Alter your route of flight by climbing, by not flying parallel to the ridge lines, or by circumnavigating the whole area if feasible. Even the most experienced mountain pilots can get into trouble because of high density altitude. It's not that they don't know what density altitude is, or its adverse effect on aircraft performance. It's just that they become complacent. At sea level, under standard conditions, we might require 1,300 feet to take off and clear an obstacle. However, at a 5,000-foot density altitude, the takeoff can easily require twice the runway or more. In addition to the takeoff distance, climb performance after takeoff will be affected by higher density altitudes. This can be a factor considering the terrain features of many mountain airports. Remember, density altitude is the altitude which the airplane thinks it is at and performs in accordance with. The first time you take off from a 5,000-foot MSL strip on a hot day, you will undoubtedly think something is wrong with the plane. It is important under these conditions to fly the same indicated airspeeds as you normally would, no matter how much faster than normal it looks like you're going. One useful rule of thumb for approximating aircraft performance is to add 600 feet to the actual airport elevation for each 10 degrees above standard temperature. This rule of thumb will rarely result in errors of more than 200 to 300 feet. Let's take a look at what an increase in temperature can mean to a light aircraft operating at high altitude and temperature. This field is located at 5,000 feet above sea level. Let's see where the aircraft lifts off the field early in the morning when the temperature is cool. Now we've jumped ahead to late afternoon. It's approximately 20 degrees warmer. Note that the takeoff distance is substantially longer now. Experienced mountain pilots always plan to operate during the coolest parts of the day, early morning or in the late afternoon. One nice thing you'll generally see at higher altitude in the mountains is that it cools off quite rapidly any time the sun is not shining. Density altitude can be computed on a density altitude chart, flight computer, electronic flight calculator, or by a rule of thumb. The value obtained will give us some idea as to the expected performance of the airplane. But the really proper way of dealing with density altitude is with the use of a Dinault performance computer. Density altitude is not only useful and meaningful in determining the takeoff distance and expected rate of climb, it also affects en route performance. Visual illusions associated with mountain flying have caused their share of accidents and incidents. One of the reasons for this is that there is often no natural horizon visible. Some of the same optical illusions we take for granted or never notice in open land become a problem for us in the mountains. By looking at the types of visual illusions we can be exposed to, we should be able to avoid them. Let's look at some examples of common optical illusions. Then I'll show you how they affect a pilot's perceptions. Here's an example of the influence of surroundings on perceived shape. The center lines seem as though they are bowed, however they are actually parallel. Here, converging lines tend to make the figure closer to these lines look larger. Measuring the posts would show that B is the tallest. On this slide, imagine line AY as being one runway and line AX as being the other runway. The shape would lead us to believe that runway AX is longer than AY. In reality, both runways are identical in length. Visual illusions such as these can be contributing factors in approach and landing accidents. In approaching a runway, a pilot customarily adjusts his glide path in accordance with what he sees. He is used to a visual relationship between the altitude, attitude, and position of his aircraft and the width and length of the runway below. When the ground slopes away, the angle of descent will appear shallower than normal, and the unprepared pilot tends to fly higher than normal. Consequently, he will find himself coming in high and hot. Because we try to adjust our glide path with a visual relationship between altitude and position, we come in high. With an upslope, even relatively small, we get an illusion of being higher than normal. This misleads us into making lower than normal approaches. The solution to this and other approach problems is simple: fly the spot method. That is, maintain a constant airspeed when on final approach. Point the nose at the spot where you wish to flare, then maintain the nose on that spot using the throttle to control altitude. Once established on final approach, the unwary pilot will tend to think he is quite low because of the unusual perspective. The natural response is to stop the descent until the picture seems right. But this will place the pilot in a position where a stabilized approach is almost impossible. This becomes an extremely critical factor when the landing site allows only one-way operations due to terrain at one end of the strip. One of the things you should do when preparing for a flight into a mountain airstrip is to determine if there is any significant slope to the runway. If so, just be sure to be prepared for it and for the visual illusion. The most useful weapon in your navigational arsenal is the sectional chart. The sectional should be used for pre-flight planning, for en route navigation, and as a reference guide. Pilotage and map reference are often the only viable navigational methods at the altitudes which our light aircraft can attain. In mountainous areas, the minimum en route altitudes for instrument flight are quite commonly 14, 16, or more thousand feet MSL. This is sometimes caused by required obstruction clearance, but more often these high altitudes are specified because they are the minimum heights at which reliable navigational radio signal reception can be obtained. Unless you and your equipment are capable of flying for extended periods at altitudes greater than 14,000 feet, plan on flying with one finger on a sectional chart at all times. Always know exactly where you are and don't lose any opportunity to confirm your location. One of the most difficult things about flying in the mountains in this way is that often the major terrain feature you see doesn't look particularly like they might on the map, especially at low altitudes. One of the easiest ways to navigate in this terrain is to follow roads and freeways. Generally, road builders seek the lowest route through the mountains. Roads seldom change their shape or route and can provide handy emergency landing sites. Railroads and power lines work well also. Just remember that often railroads are routed through tunnels at high mountain passes. Not only will the railroad disappear in the tunnel, but you may be led into a dead end or box canyon by a railroad if you're not careful. Let's review some important and frequently missed symbols which you will find on sectional charts. First, let's look at the way mountain passes are depicted on a sectional. Passes are generally only shown in areas of very high terrain, where a pass may be the only way through for light aircraft. It's important to remember that NOAA, who published the charts, know absolutely nothing about the performance of your aircraft or about your skill and experience as a pilot. They are not recommending that you plan to fly through these passes, only depicting them on charts. It's a sad fact that the slopes approaching many of the passes you find on charts are littered with the remains of light aircraft that were not capable of climbing high enough or whose pilots were surprised by turbulence or downdrafts. Remember, the wind velocity through mountain passes is often much higher than that found in the surrounding free air due to a Venturi effect. Next, let's talk about wires and transmission lines. NOAA tries very hard to depict wires outside of developed areas on sectional charts, but in reality, only a small percentage of those which actually exist make it to the charts. In many parts of the country, utility companies have marked these wires with large plastic high-visibility balls to help pilots. But for every set of cables which are marked, there are probably 20 others which are not. Even on a crystal clear day, it can be almost impossible for a pilot traveling at 150 miles per hour to spot a cable in time to avoid it. This is especially true in valleys and canyons where the wire may not be outlined against the sky. Always watch out for cables if you're flying near the terrain in the mountains. Watch for poles or pole shadows at the lip of a canyon, or for areas where high-tension lines suddenly disappear. There are three kinds of roads which you will find depicted in the mountains on sectional charts. You will see major highways, which make excellent navigational aids. You will see two-lane paved secondary roads, which are also useful. And you will see narrow dirt or gravel roads and trails in profusion. These are not quite so useful for navigation, as they are subject to washouts, alterations, and changes. Dirt roads, depending on the surrounding terrain, may also be camouflaged and blend in with the environment. Be careful if you intend to use a dirt road for navigational assistance. It is very easy to follow the wrong branch of the road, or to discover a part of the road which doesn't seem to match the map because it has changed since the last chart update. Lakes and dams and rivers can be excellent navigational aids. Keep in mind that the shape, volume, and appearance of a lake can vary tremendously with the seasons. The lakes which seem to change the most in this manner are the dry lakes of the West. Certain times of the year, these lakes are totally dry. Other times, after a heavy rain, they fill up. If you're planning to use a lake as a checkpoint, especially if it is depicted as a non-perennial lake on the chart, understand that you're looking for a large empty area which may or may not contain water. Many pilots who are unfamiliar with the details of Western mountain geography assume that the only way to travel east or west across the Rockies or Sierras is via a straight line at 14,000 feet. In reality, most mountain flights can be conducted at much lower altitude by simply doing some creative flight planning. Most of the western United States is composed of high desert and plateaus at 4,000 to 7,000 feet MSL, not continuous jagged peaks. A flight, for instance, from Idaho Falls, Idaho to Yakima, Washington, can be made at 14,500 feet, more or less direct. The straight-line route takes you over some of the most inhospitable mountain wilderness in the country. It's a beautiful flight, but one with relatively few outs in the event of an emergency. On a nice day, this same flight can be made without ever climbing above 6,500 feet if you follow the Snake River Valley through Boise, Idaho, Baker, and Pendleton, Oregon areas. The difference in distance and time en route is about 15%. The lower route also keeps you within easy range of good airports for all but a few minutes of the flight. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that going from point A to point B in a straight line is always a bad thing to do in the mountains. I'm just suggesting that you evaluate your priorities, skill, and equipment. Make a good judgment about the best and most comfortable routing for you, your passengers, and your aircraft, given the known conditions on the day of the trip. If you decide to go direct from one point to another over high terrain, make sure that your aircraft is capable of maintaining the required altitude at all times. Remember that published service ceilings are valid for a new aircraft in perfect conditions operating at standard temperatures. Climb performance and service ceiling are related strongly to density altitude, not pressure altitude. Also remember that the altitude required is not just the ridge top level, but also a bit more to allow for downdrafts and turbulence. There are a couple of things I'd like you to think about regarding mental attitude when flying in the mountains. When you're flying down near sea level and you have to cross a little bit of uneven terrain, it probably doesn't seem like a problem. It doesn't get you sitting upright in your seat with that serious look on your face. After all, you've got all that aircraft performance to back you up, and you probably are crossing the terrain with plenty of room to spare. On the other hand, take that same little bit of terrain and put it at 11,000 feet above sea level, and the situation changes. You may not be quite so relaxed about it. There's a different set of problems associated with the higher terrain. If there was no difference, we probably wouldn't be looking at this tape. What we have to do is convert fears or concerns into problems to be solved. Like any safety measure in aviation, the best insurance you can provide yourself is adequate preparation. Preparations such as being familiar with alternate routes, weather factors, and making sure the airplane is ready for the demands you will make on it. The biggest fear, and the one which is most difficult to adapt to comfortably, is fear of the unknown, and that is a fear we can manage. The attitude you want to have when you're flying in the mountains is that no matter what happens, you know how you will respond and react. If the engine fails now, what will I do? If thunderstorms grow to block my route, where will I go? Which way should I head to get to more civilized or lower terrain? One of the best defenses you have available is to understand that pilot in command means literally in command of yourself, your flight, your aircraft, and your alternatives. Let's talk about flight through canyons and narrower valleys. First of all, where in the canyon should we fly? The best place, for two reasons, is to fly along one side rather than in the center. The first reason, and the most important, is so that you give yourself the maximum possible room for a course reversal. Why fly down the center of a canyon if it means that to turn around you must perform a high G turn near the terrain? The second reason for keeping to one side is that if you choose the downwind side, the updraft side, the air will generally be quite a bit smoother than either the center or the upwind side. The center of canyons and valleys is generally quite choppy when there is any significant wind. This is because the downdrafts from the upwind side and the updrafts on the downwind side meet near the center and create a burbling, choppy shear. The third reason for flying along the downwind side of the canyon is that if you do need to turn around, you will be turning into the wind. This will tend to shorten the overall turn radius referenced to the ground. The fourth and last reason for flying the downwind side of the canyon is that you will be in a generally rising air mass. When I say to fly along the side of the canyon, I don't mean to just edge over a little bit from the center line. In order to enjoy the benefits of lift on the downwind side, you really have to fly within a couple of 100 yards of the side. Most pilots are a little bit terrain shy and tend to fly as far from the sides of a canyon as possible. This may seem safe, but in reality, it is not the safest path. Most canyons and valleys slope from higher to lower terrain. The safest way to fly is from high to low. That is, fly down canyons from the high end to the low end. If this is impractical, then make sure you have sufficient altitude, considering any possible downdrafts, to fly above the obstructions at the high end before you enter the canyon. And if you must fly up a canyon, make sure to fly at an airspeed sufficiently above best angle of climb speed so that you have speed in the bank. Usually in smooth air, this will be at or near the best rate of climb airspeed. In rough air, pick a speed 10 to 20 knots faster than the best rate of climb. Having this extra speed available will come in handy if you get into trouble. It will allow you to climb during a turnaround. Always remember, if you must make a quick course reversal, that the worst thing that can happen is to stall and spin into the rough terrain. To be safe, you must only fly into areas where a normal, low-G, descending turn will allow you to extricate yourself. Just be aware that a 40-degree bank at 90 knots will require a total turn diameter of more than 1,800 feet, about a third of a mile. One common rule of thumb for mountain flying is to constantly evaluate how you would extricate yourself from a box canyon situation or from an engine failure. Look at where you are and decide if you could lose altitude prior to having to turn the aircraft. If not, you are narrowing your options substantially. Earlier, we talked a bit about researching and choosing a destination. You have already established that there's fuel available if needed. You know whether the strip is usable and that it is not closed or made hazardous by some seasonal constraint. You have evaluated the field length in terms of the probable density altitude and determined that you can both land and take off with safe margins. And you have a plan and an alternate in case you can't get into your field of choice. This business of an alternate is a most important and often overlooked factor. Here we are planning to land at an out-of-the-way mountain airport or backcountry strip. What if we get there and after looking over the field determine it is not usable or that it is marginally safe? What if there are winds, downdrafts, or turbulence which make the outcome of a landing attempt uncertain? The point is, make sure whenever you're flying in the mountains, as you should any time, that you arrive with sufficient fuel to allow yourself some options. It's bad form to arrive in an isolated 1,200-foot one-way strip with 20 minutes of fuel only to discover 25-knot crosswinds gusting to 40. Okay, we've arrived at the new field and we're getting ready to land. First of all, before we ever arrived, we should have some idea what the layout, surface, and surrounding terrain may look like. It's amazing how hard it can be to locate a grass strip next to a river sometimes. But then you have been navigating continually and know right where it is, right? The first thing we want to do is take a look at the field as it is situated regarding the terrain. The wise pilot has already talked to someone knowledgeable about the approaches to backcountry fields, but you still need to look over the terrain yourself before getting down low where you lose perspective. Does the field look like it's one way? Are there drainages running near the approach end of the runway which may cause wind shear? Are there aircraft, cars, or trucks on or near the runway? Are there animals anywhere in view? Is there standing water on the surface? Try to establish from the terrain and other factors where a safe go, no-go point will be on the approach. At some strips, you can choose a landing spot and go around if you miss it. At other strips, particularly those with high terrain off one end, or those in canyons, the go, no-go point may be a mile or more from the approach end.
Okay, we'll complete our pre-landing check. Fuel selectors on both. Mixtures adjusted in case we need to make a go-around. Increase the propeller RPM. Little sink right here. Stay in a position where we can go toward lowering terrain. There's no problem. Wind's calm, we'll land upstream. And we come over to Little Rise here, and we should be able to see the airport. Don't get so low on final that you stall and drop in. The difference between a good short field landing and a bouncing, out-of-control arrival must be managed. Don't let the plane fly you. Stay in command. One other thing I want to mention. Before you land in a new field, take the time to look it over and decide what the safest and easiest departure procedure will be. Once you're on the ground, you won't have any perspective of the valleys, hills, and canyons surrounding you. Before you ever depart, you absolutely have to know exactly what path you're going to fly and where the traps are located. There's a proper airspeed for every aircraft on approach. People get into trouble at short fields when they start to add 5 knots here and 10 knots there because they think it's safer. The recommended indicated airspeeds don't change just because a field is higher or lower, or shorter, or shortest. Remember that a 10% increase in approach speed yields a 21% increase in landing distance. You need to be making a stabilized approach at the proper speed for your aircraft. Going slower isn't going to help either. If you go too slow, you'll probably just run out of elevator early and make a hard landing, if you're lucky. You want to be able to maintain some power throughout the approach, so begin to slow to approach speed early and get the aircraft properly configured as soon as possible. The last thing you'll need is a cold engine which doesn't want to respond for a go-around. Making short field landings, you want to control airspeed with pitch and sink rate with power. If you're too low, increase power and back pressure. If you're too high, decrease power and back pressure. Once you begin the flare, keep in mind that you want to make a tail-low, full stall landing, especially on rough strips. On any unpaved field, make a full, soft field landing. Once you're on the ground, make sure you maintain directional control. While you are slowing, evaluate the runway remaining at all times and think about whether you're going to make it. If you're close to the end of the runway and you think you're not going to make it, be aware it's usually better to hit obstructions at a slow speed than fast. Before you try a go-around from the runway, you've got to know absolutely that you can make it. If the distance remaining is marginal, the aircraft is dirty and configured wrong for climb, and you're uncertain about the success of a go-around, you may be better off to continue slowing down and take your lumps. We've arrived at our mountain strip, and one of the first things I want you to do is secure your airplane. There's a possibility of gusty wind conditions in these canyons, and we don't want the airplane to become damaged. A lot of the tie-down facilities are primitive or non-existent at mountain strips, so you can pick up a very inexpensive tie-down kit at one of your grocery stores or pet supply stores. These amount to a dog stake, which we can screw into the ground. After screwing these in, we can tie the airplane down, and we're all set to go out and enjoy our wilderness experience. Now, at some of these mountain strips, we have animals, cattle and other things which could damage the airplane. If we have a fabric airplane, the animals like nothing better than to eat them. Or if we have a metal airplane, they'll like to come up and rub against them, and this can inflict severe damage. One other point when we're at this strip is we want to park the airplane in a manner so that it doesn't obstruct the other pilots using the strip.
The most critical operations at many backcountry mountain airstrips is the takeoff and departure. Many more aircraft are lost during these phases of flight than any other. It's just that the safety margins are reduced to a greater or lesser extent, so a pilot can't get away with many practices that are common in more hospitable terrain. At most mountain strips, you will need to plan for a departure during the cooler parts of the day.
Obviously, this must be a judgment call on the part of the pilot, but the heavier you are loaded and the higher the airstrip, the more important it becomes. Overloading is a frequently cited cause of accidents involving aircraft operating in the mountains. For mountain flying, you should carry only the essentials, but don't conserve by cutting short your fuel supply or survival equipment. If the weight of the airplane is increased 10%, there will be a 5% increase in the speed necessary for rotation, a 9% decrease in acceleration, and a 21% increase in takeoff distance. Weight and balance are not just concerns for low-performance aircraft in the mountains. Even higher performance aircraft are usually operated well below gross weight when in the backcountry. Just because a Cessna 172 has 4 seats is no reason to assume that it should carry 4 adults on trips into the mountains, especially with lots of fuel.
Many backcountry strips are quite short, and many a pilot is wound up in the trees trying to make a midday, hot, heavy takeoff. Often when an airstrip is located next to a river, you'll find that the common procedure is to land upstream and depart downstream. This practice is founded in the fact that most often this allows you to land uphill and depart downhill. Usually, even with a tailwind up to 10 knots or so, you're better off departing downhill. It takes quite a bit of tailwind to cancel out the sluggish acceleration you'll experience going up a grade.
Your early research into the strip and your aerial observations as you flew over it should have told you whether or not you have a choice of directions for takeoff. Obviously, high terrain or obstructions at one end of the strip may make it inadvisable or impossible to take off in that direction regardless of the gradient of the runway. Study the wind carefully before you start the aircraft's engine. Is the prevailing direction such that you're going to encounter very strong downdrafts after liftoff, or maybe hazardous turbulence?
Take another look at your sectional chart so that you can establish for sure the relationship between what you saw, what you're seeing from the ground, and what the map shows. Make sure you know exactly where you're going to go and how high you will have to be at all times. Also, take a minute to plan for disaster. What will you do if the engine quits 100 feet in the air? Are you better off going into the trees, into the water? Think through what you will have to do. And never lose sight of the fact that a controlled collision with treetops, terrain, or water is always better than to crash out of control as the result of a stall or spin.
Most mountain strips are not going to allow you much margin for mechanical problems. So perform a pre-flight as if your life depended on it. It does. Be sure and check the propeller and make sure you haven't picked up any rocks which cause nicks and could cause a stress concentration which would cause the propeller to fail. When you test the fuel, use the manufacturer's recommendation. Many people are lax on this and don't do what the manufacturer says, or they fail to check the fuel totally. I think we're ready to go. Be sure and give your passengers a pre-flight briefing as to what to expect on departure if you have to make any steep turns or something like this because of terrain or obstructions. Also, tell them about the terrain that you will be flying over so that they don't become unduly alarmed. Also, you'll want to give them a briefing as to the use of their seat belts, the seat adjustments, the location of emergency equipment such as your first aid kit, the fire extinguisher, and your survival equipment. Also, how to evacuate the airplane should it become necessary. Some mountain pilots perform a run-up while they're taxiing so that they minimize the chance of picking up rocks or debris and damaging the propeller. Now this is okay as long as you maintain control of the aircraft and you don't ground loop or run off the end or sides of the runway.
Whatever kind of run-up you do, make sure it is a thorough one and make sure you are absolutely happy with the engine before proceeding. Every aircraft and engine has a different procedure for leaning at high density altitudes, so I can't give you any specific guidance. At higher altitudes, it is important to have the engine developing as much power as possible for takeoff, so many aircraft require leaning. You should get familiar with the procedure for your airplane before you get into the mountains so that you're comfortable with it. Before you begin your takeoff roll, locate a go, no-go point on the runway. This should be a point where you have attained a predetermined speed or you will abort the takeoff. Get off the ground as soon as safely possible. Then level off and gain some airspeed rather than holding an extreme pitch attitude. You want to make sure that you don't get into the deficit side of the power curve and mush along with no airspeed, power, or altitude in reserve.
In this tape, Sparky has shown you how to fly safely in the mountains. Now let's discuss for a few minutes things you can do if the worst happens. We talked to search and rescue experts who work in the mountainous areas of Idaho to get some hints. The people we talked to emphasize these facts. Whenever possible, file a flight plan. Stay on the flight route. If your route changes, notify someone by radio. If you are not on a flight plan, make position reports to flight service stations along the route. Always make sure that your ELT is in proper working order. Test the ELT after installation of new batteries, and always make sure that time remains before the batteries reach their expiration date.
Pay careful attention to your ELT system. It's the best friend you can have in the unfortunate event you go down. Search and rescue forces can be seriously hampered when this unit doesn't activate. So remember, it's good insurance.
Carry some kind of warm clothing on any flight, even in the summer. Exposure is the second greatest cause of fatalities. Carry a survival kit. The kit should include first aid supplies, the kind you will need to control major bleeding and injury, not just some Band-Aids. You may wish to consult with your family physician to find out the most important things to take. Items like a plastic disposable airway, compresses, and large triangular bandages are commonly recommended. The best advice for a first aid kit is to match the kit to the skill and training of the user. Also carry visibility enhancement supplies, things that will help the searchers find you. These may include large, lightweight orange parkas, matches, smoke bombs, a signaling mirror, and flares. You might consider some lightweight containers for water. Dehydration ranks right up there with injuries and exposure as a major hazard. Carrying some water or non-perishable beverage with you in an unbreakable container may not be a bad idea. Pack a few tools. A lightweight saw, a shovel, and a combination tool may be very useful for extrication at the crash site. Stay with the aircraft. Unless there is some compelling reason not to, it's much easier for searchers to find an airplane than it is to locate individual survivors. If you must leave the crash site, take your sectional chart along to navigate, and if possible, consider taking the aircraft's magnetic compass along as well. The biggest single factor in survival is your attitude. Many determined people have survived nearly impossible circumstances with few, if any, supplies. They have survived by using their heads, by not panicking. Sparky has discussed many of the skills and challenges of mountain flying. It may seem like he was trying to discourage you from flying around high terrain. That was not his aim. Mountain flying offers some of the most challenging flying experiences possible. It also offers flights into places of unparalleled beauty. As long as a pilot is careful, skillful, and prudent, the extra risks can be managed. Before you venture into the mountains, see about getting some dual from an experienced flight instructor. Many mountain area airports offer short courses in mountain operations for pilots with no prior experience. We at TCA Productions hope that you enjoy your mountain flying experiences and that all of your flights will be safe ones.